When I started seminary in 2015, I was required to take a class called Race as Context. It was a brand new class designed to ensure that each of us incoming students understood how race affected the way we experienced the world and the way others experienced us. The class was revelatory. I had grown up in a middle-class suburban neighborhood, had gone to college and graduate school to study science, and had worked in the environmental field for years. All of these were largely European American dominant environments. I was also a good liberal UU who believed in equality, marched in the Pride Parade when I had time, and gave to good causes. And I figured that was enough. But now here I was in a classroom with Black students, Asian students, Pacific Island students, white students who had similar backgrounds to mine, and white students who had been activists for a long time. I started hearing truths that made me deeply uncomfortable. And I had to look at how much I take for granted in my life, how little I know about how skin color affects our experiences in this world, how much my own behavior upholds what is a racist system. I was frustrated to find out that I couldn't count on being a good person with good intentions. I would need to earn trust through my actions. These were painful, painful lessons. At the same time, outside of class, I was getting to know many of the other students. A multiracial group of us would gather in the cafeteria for dinner before class. As we joked and talked, I listened, and relationships developed across race, across cultures, and across life experiences. I began to hear my classmates' stories. I got a glimpse of the way society treated people who were Black, who were Indigenous, who were people of color. I started noticing the small acts of discrimination and bias that were directed towards them. And I started to understand that I could never fully grasp what it was like to be Black or Samoan or Japanese in the US. But I also started to understand that it was my responsibility to help change the system. That was the beginning of my education in deeply ingrained racism and white supremacy culture. And I know that phrase, white supremacy culture, kind of appalls many white people because of its implication that we individuals are white supremacists. And that's not the case. However, we do live in a culture that is designed to benefit white people and to disadvantage, exclude, and even criminalize people who are not white. And if I have internalized and benefited from that system, believing that if everyone just acted like I did, if everyone were peaceful and nice like me, that everything would be just fine, well, I now knew better. And I also benefited all through seminary. I took classes from Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt, who is Black and a longtime UU minister, and from many other teachers who had all kinds of different backgrounds. And all of that helped me learn. So in the past few years, the Unitarian Universalist Association has gone through a similar awakening of sorts about white privilege and systemic racism in the organization. It is true, of course, that some, though certainly not all, early Unitarians and Universalists were involved in social welfare and abolition efforts in the 1800s. And it's also true that in the 1960s, many UU ministers were very active in the civil rights movement. And in 1965, for example, a full 1 in 5 UU ministers in the country answered Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to Selma. Is that amazing? And a white UU minister, of course, named James Reeb, was killed there. And as tragic as that was, it was probably his death that kind of raised awareness of what was going on in the South and really helped turn the tide toward the civil rights bill. So just a few years later, however, that commitment started to waver. There was something that is generally referred to as the empowerment controversy in Unitarian Universalism, also often referred to as the white power controversy. And beginning in 1967, a group of Black UUs pressed for a seat at the table of power in the UUA, the Unitarian Universalist Association. You having trouble hearing me? Sorry. Is that better? Okay. I'm still getting over that cold, and I think I'm just speaking quietly. So kind of in the larger movement, Black UUs wanted to have more autonomy and more representation. And so although a Black Affairs Council was established during that time, the autonomy and funding that were requested and promised actually fell through, causing many Black UUs to leave the faith altogether. I'm going to quote Reverend Marcia Stannard in a sermon she gave last year. She said, "UUs are not actively racist. We believe all humans should be treated with respect and dignity, no matter the color of their skin. But we are a part of this society that has racism coded into our systems, into our hiring processes where fit is often valued more than diversity. Racism is coded into our healthcare systems, into housing, into education. Outcomes aren't the same because opportunities aren't the same," she said. Well, in 2017, so just 5 years ago, there was a hiring controversy that arose within the Unitarian Universalist Association, and it highlighted that structural racism. It exposed to white leadership something that religious professionals of color have known for a long time, that white privilege is alive and well in this organization and in our congregations. Existing structures and approaches that have been in place for decades make people of color uncomfortable at best and block them out at worst. We know these systems are in place in most institutions across the country, so it is not at all that surprising to find them in Unitarian Universalism, but it is deeply disconcerting for an organization and its member congregations that profess a desire to be welcoming and multicultural. A couple of key responses arose from that hiring controversy. Hang on a second. The first was the authorization of the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change. And the second was something that's been talked about here recently before, that 8th principle was proposed. So the Commission on Institutional Change was charged in 2017 with supporting long-term cultural and institutional change that redeems the essential promise and ideals of Unitarian Universalism. The commission was to conduct an audit of the power structures and analyze systemic racism and white supremacy culture within the UUA. In the process, they documented ways that many Black people, Indigenous people, and other people of color have been impacted by those structures, and also how they experience hurt, rejection, and harm in UU congregations. Their findings were published in an important document called Widening the Circle of Concern, which came out in 2020. And you can read the entire thing online. And if you want the link to read it, I will be happy to give it to you. And actually, I would love to see a study group start here to go through it together. It's very interesting. Now, the eighth principle then was proposed as a way for congregations to remedy some of the harms caused by structural racism and white privilege. The eighth principle arises out of the other seven, but it offers something more: a demonstrated long-term accountable commitment to action. The eighth principle website says the idea came from Paula Cole-Jones, a regional director of racial and social justice within the UUA, who noticed that there were two paradigms in Unitarian Universalist circles. The first is the UU's 7 principles, and the second was beloved community, or deep multiculturalism. They're two different things. She found that UUs, generally white UUs, could follow the principles and think like me that they were good UUs without ever addressing racism. She and other anti-racist activists developed the language specifically in the eighth principle, specifically to address dismantling of racism and other oppressions. It was first adopted by the UU Church of the Restoration in Philadelphia and was recommended for adoption by the UUA. And as you heard earlier, over 220 individual congregations have now adopted it. And that was kind of a movement, so that if each individual congregation adopted it, then there would be a groundswell for adopting it by the UUA, or somehow or other incorporating it into the principles that we have. Now, some have suggested that the eighth principle reads more like a statement of purpose or mission than like the other principles, and some want to change the language before it's adopted. And I wholeheartedly believe that we must follow the lead of the people who are most impacted in any situation, the people who are advocating for their own liberation. And in this case, it is Black people, Indigenous people, people of color. So the language needs to be adopted as it is written. Some people have expressed that the eighth principles focus on racism, that they're concerned that the eighth principle focuses on racism over other oppressions. And it's important that we work to end all inadvertent marginalization, whether based on gender equity or gender identity and expression, disability, neurodivergence, other identities. But marginalization on the basis of race has been with this organization and in the nation for hundreds of years, with progress, but not nearly as much progress as we need to see. So now is the time to address racism in order to move us closer to beloved community, the diverse multicultural faith tradition and congregation we wish to be. And we can't just wish away racism by claiming to be colorblind. While we want to move in the direction of a society where the color of one's skin doesn't matter, in today's world, color matters very much. So to claim a colorblind society is actually to try to codify racism by making it unmentionable. So what would it mean to accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions? Now, it may mean different things to different groups of people within a congregation, different groups active in a congregation. But accountability would mean making a commitment to consistently consider whether our policies and practices exclude anyone, and how to change them to include everyone. It would mean continually asking who we want to be in relationship with, and being willing to change ourselves in order to build and maintain those relationships. So as you can see, voting to adopt the 8th principle, making a commitment to be anti-racist, anti-oppressions, would only be the beginning of a lifelong process. It would mean figuring out what actions this congregation wants to undertake in order to dismantle these things. And these actions could be anything from book studies and trainings, educating ourselves, to reviewing the processes, like how we do nominations, how we do hiring, all those things, to see how they're structured and who might be in and who might be out because of them. It might mean forming partnerships with other faith-based groups, and that are primarily made up of traditionally marginalized people, and following their lead, seeing how we can be of use and following their lead. It means making sure that whatever projects the congregation takes on, within or outside these walls, they are consistent with this commitment. And it means accepting that the ways we do things are not the only ways, that it's important to question or change procedures if it appears that they favor some people over others. So ultimately, it means having the courage to change our congregations and ourselves in order to become the beloved community, the multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational community we want to be. It is not enough to welcome everyone as long as they act like those of us who are already here. It means being willing to change practices to be truly, radically welcoming. It's not an easy task, but it is the way forward. So I'm aware, very aware, that it means changing myself. I've learned that I have to keep educating myself, keep speaking up when I see discrimination, keep challenging structures of white privilege, keep finding ways to really be proximal. I love that term that I think Brian Stevenson talks about, be proximal with people who are not like me, don't have the background that I have. And to keep challenging those structures of white privilege, even though they benefit me. A wonderful thing about Unitarian Universalism is that its bylaws require a periodic review of the principles and purposes of this organization. So when Unitarians and Universalists merged in 1961, they adopted 6 principles that are quite different from the ones we have today. The current principles and sources were adopted in 1985 and have been tweaked slightly since then to remove gendered language. But the process of adopting them was done with patience and consensus building over nearly a decade. And of course, that process is going on again right now. The bylaws are being reviewed. And you can bet, again, that the spirit of the 8th principle will be incorporated into any new version. And with patience and consensus building and the courage to change, the new principles will guide us into the future. Our principles and our desire for that sense of beloved community, that universalism, that we are all one, call us to do this work. And together, we can bring about the kind of just, equitable, loving world, that heaven on earth that we seek. May it be so. Amen.